The command came with the sharpness of a knife. Standing at the center of the grand marble foyer, Victor Lancaster's voice cut through the air like a blade. "Pack your things and get out, now." Grace Williams froze, her hands still clutching the silver tray she'd been carrying from the dining room. The echo of his words bounced against the high ceilings, wrapping her in a sudden, suffocating silence. Behind Victor, a cluster of staff members stood awkwardly, eyes darting away, afraid to meet hers. It wasn't just an order. It was a performance, a calculated humiliation. Victor's tailored suit caught the light of the chandelier, but it was his smirk that burned into Grace's memory. "I've tolerated enough of your mistakes," he continued, his tone dripping with contempt. The truth was, Grace had made none. Not tonight, not ever. But in the world of men like Victor, truth was irrelevant if it didn't serve their pride. Her pulse roared in her ears. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her, the sting of injustice like a physical blow. She wanted to speak, to tell him exactly what she thought, but the knot in her throat made it impossible. The tray trembled slightly in her grip. The staff didn't move to help her, not because they didn't care, but because they knew Victor's wrath. He had built his empire on fear, on the unspoken rule that no one crossed him and walked away unscathed. And tonight, Grace was the example he wanted to make. She placed the tray down with slow, deliberate care, refusing to let him see her hands shake. Every step she took toward the servants' quarters felt like walking through wet cement. Her mind swirled, not with fear, but with something sharper, colder, determination. In the privacy of her small room, she sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the cracked leather suitcase by her feet. 10 years she'd worked in this house, 10 years of cleaning rooms she'd never be invited to stay in, of serving meals she could never afford to eat. Yet, as she folded her uniform into the suitcase, she couldn't help but think, "I know this house better than he ever will." Victor Lancaster had no idea who he'd just pushed out the door. Before her husband died, Grace had lived a very different life. They'd built a modest but thriving import business together. Her husband had been smart, strategic in ways Victor could only dream of, and he had taught her every detail of their trade. But after his sudden death, debts and betrayal from supposed friends had left her with nothing. Or so she thought. As she zipped the suitcase, her gaze caught on the small wooden box on her nightstand. Inside was a letter her husband had written just months before he passed, a letter she had never fully understood. "One day, Grace, you'll need this," it read, and enclosed were documents tied to investments she'd long forgotten about. Victor thought he was done with her. He thought this night would end her story. He was wrong. If you're enjoying this story of justice and hidden strength, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to find out how a simple act of prejudice turned into the most valuable lesson of Victor Lancaster's life. Grace took one last look around the room, her mind already setting the first stones in a path she hadn't dared to walk in years. She closed the suitcase, straightened her back, and stepped into the night without looking back. The bus ride into the city was long, but Grace barely noticed the blur of headlights and passing shadows beyond the rain-streaked window. Her thoughts had slipped backward in time to a version of herself she'd almost forgotten, a version wearing crisp suits instead of a maid's uniform, walking into boardrooms with her husband's hand warm against hers. Back then, Grace and Michael Williams had been a team. He had the big ideas, she had the sharp eye for detail. Together, they'd turned a small import shop into a profitable business. Michael had called her his quiet compass, the one who could sense the direction, even when the path was unclear. She'd laughed then, not realizing how much those words would matter. But life had its own way of humbling people. Michael's sudden death in a car accident left Grace reeling, and in the weeks that followed, their so-called friends descended like vultures. Contracts were broken, accounts drained. Within 3 months, the business they had built was gone, and Grace found herself with debt she couldn't even begin to repay. She'd sold their home, sold her car, sold anything that might keep the collectors at bay. It was during those desperate days that she accepted the maid's job at Lancaster Manor. She told herself it was temporary, a way to survive while she rebuilt. But survival had a way of becoming routine, and routine had a way of swallowing ambition whole. She'd buried her past deep, locking away the parts of herself that had once made decisions worth millions. To Victor Lancaster, she was nothing more than a servant. That was how she'd stayed invisible for a decade, until tonight. The memory of his smug face as he dismissed her gnawed at her. Not because of the insult itself, she'd weathered far worse, but because of the certainty in his voice. Victor believed he held all the power, and that was dangerous for him. Grace reached into her handbag and pulled out the small wooden box she'd brought with her. The bus's overhead light flickered as she opened it, revealing the stack of neatly folded papers inside. The smell of cedar clung to them just as it had when her husband first pressed them into her hands. She'd never read them closely. At the time, she couldn't bear to. But now she unfolded the top document and began scanning its lines. Her pulse quickened. These weren't sentimental keepsakes. They were records, official ownership certificates, foreign bank statements, and what looked like partial claims to real estate overseas. Assets she hadn't touched, hadn't even remembered. Assets that could be liquidated. Michael's letter echoed in her mind. "One day, Grace, you'll need this." The bus jolted to a stop, and Grace's reflection in the window caught her eye. She didn't see a maid anymore. She saw a strategist. Someone who knew the mansion's layout, the routines of its owner, even the fragile threads holding his empire together. Victor Lancaster had taken away her job, but he had also unknowingly handed her the reason to reclaim everything she'd lost, and more. By the time she stepped off the bus into the slick streets of downtown, her course was set. She would not simply survive this, she would turn it into her victory. The rain had slowed to a mist by the time Grace ducked into the small cafe on the corner of Whitmore and 7th. The place hadn't changed in the 15 years since she and Michael used to come here after long days at the docks. Same chipped counters, same smell of strong coffee and baked bread, same old clock that always seemed to run 5 minutes slow. She was shaking the water from her coat when a voice called her name. "Grace? Grace Williams?" She turned to see a tall man in a charcoal overcoat, his hair peppered with grey, but his smile exactly as she remembered. "Daniel," she breathed. Daniel Price. They had once been close friends. He and Michael had worked together on several shipping contracts. Daniel had been the kind of man who remembered birthdays, who sent handwritten thank you notes. But when Michael died, Daniel had disappeared like the rest. "I thought you moved out of the city," he said, sliding into the booth across from her, once they'd exchanged awkward pleasantries. "I did," she said carefully. "Been working out in the suburbs?" No need to elaborate on her uniform or the 10 years under Victor Lancaster's roof. Daniel stirred his coffee, his eyes sharp, despite his easy smile. "Funny, I ran into Victor Lancaster last month. He was at a charity auction, throwing his weight around like he owned the place. Only," he lowered his voice, "word is, things aren't as solid for him as they look." Grace's fingers tightened around her mug. "What do you mean?" He's leveraged himself to the teeth. Real estate deals gone sideways. Debt piling up. If one more major lender pulls out, he could lose everything, including that mansion of his. The words slid into her mind like a key into a lock. The papers in her wooden box. Michael's investments, the knowledge of every creak and corridor in Lancaster Manor. Daniel leaned back. If I were a betting man, I'd say the place will end up in foreclosure within the year. Grace forced herself to sip her coffee slowly, masking the thrum of adrenaline in her chest. Foreclosure, you say? She murmured, as if it were idle curiosity. He nodded. And if it does, the auction will be public. Deep pockets could pick it up for a song compared to its worth. A plan began to take root, each detail branching out from that single sentence. She had the means now, thanks to Michael's foresight. She had the motivation, sharpened by Victor's cruelty. And she had something far more dangerous than money, knowledge. The conversation drifted to other things, mutual acquaintances, the changing skyline, but Grace barely heard any of it. In her mind, she was already standing at the edge of the marble foyer again, only this time she wasn't the one being told to leave. When she finally stepped back into the street, the rain had stopped entirely. The air was crisp, the city lights glistening off wet pavement. Grace pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders, the corners of her mouth lifting into the smallest, most dangerous of smiles. Victor Lancaster had unknowingly set the clock ticking on his own downfall. And when the time came, she would be ready to strike. Grace didn't sleep that night. Instead, she sat at the small kitchen table in her apartment, the wooden box open before her, its contents spread out like a map to another life. Bank statements in multiple currencies, property deeds from coastal towns she'd never visited. Investment certificates tied to companies she hadn't thought about in a decade. With each document she examined, the numbers became clearer in her head. Michael's investments weren't just dormant, they were healthy. Some had doubled in value, others tripled. Her late husband had hidden these assets not to keep them from her, but to protect them until she was ready, or until she needed them. And tonight, she needed them. By dawn, Grace had formed the skeleton of a plan. Step 1. Verify Victor's financial instability. Step 2. Quietly prepare her own capital. Step 3. Wait for the right moment to strike. She knew where to start. Lancaster Manor had a small private office tucked behind the library, a place most staff never entered. Grace had dusted it countless times, and in doing so, she'd memorized its layout. More importantly, she knew Victor's habits, how he left documents half-folded on the desk, how he scribbled reminders on sticky notes and left them clinging to the edge of his monitor. 2 days later, she was back in the neighborhood, dressed not as a maid, but in a plain charcoal coat and gloves. She wasn't breaking in, at least, not technically. The side gate still had the same faulty latch she'd reported years ago. She slipped through with the ease of someone who'd done it before. Inside the office, the air was heavy with the scent of expensive cigars. Grace's eyes scanned the desk. There, an envelope marked "Urgent" in bold red letters. She slid it out just enough to read the header. Notice of default. Her pulse quickened. Another envelope, this one from a law firm, contained words she knew all too well. Foreclosure proceedings. She replaced everything exactly as she'd found it, her gloves ensuring no trace was left behind. Victor Lancaster, the man who had built his reputation on untouchable wealth, was standing on a cliff's edge, and he didn't even know someone was now watching, ready to give the final push. That night, Grace met with an old contact from her business days, a discreet financial advisor named Evelyn. Over tea, Grace laid out her resources and her goal. Evelyn didn't flinch. "You're in a position to not just buy the property," she said, "but to do it in a way that keeps him from even knowing you're the buyer until it's too late." The thought was delicious. Victor, standing at the auction, watching his legacy slip through his fingers, completely unaware that the woman he'd humiliated was about to own everything he'd once lorded over her. Grace left the meeting with more than a plan. She left with a timeline. The waiting would be the hardest part. But patience was a skill she had mastered long before she ever stepped foot in Lancaster Manor. Winter settled over the city with a sharp wind and the smell of wood smoke drifting through the street. Grace used those quiet, cold weeks to work in silence, moving pieces into place the way a chess player clears a path for checkmate. It was Evelyn who introduced her to Henry Collins, a retired attorney who had once specialized in property law. He had a sharp mind, the kind that never really aged, and a dry wit that reminded Grace of her husband. Henry listened carefully as she outlined her situation, from Victor's public dismissal to the discovery of Michael's investments, and finally to the foreclosure notices she'd found in the mansion's office. When she finished, he simply nodded. "If the bank takes the property to auction, it will go to the highest bidder. That's the law. What you need is to be in the right place at the right time, with your financing ready and your identity masked until the deal is sealed." Grace leaned forward. "Can that be done?" Henry's lips curved into the faintest smile. "With the right paperwork, yes. I've handled more complicated acquisitions than this, though none quite as poetic." The word poetic clung to her. There was something almost literary about it, this idea of turning an act of humiliation into an act of complete reclamation. For the next month, Henry worked quietly on her behalf, establishing a trust under a name that would mean nothing to Victor or his associates. Evelyn handled the liquidity of her assets, converting Michael's investments into ready cash without drawing public attention. Grace herself kept watch on Lancaster Manor, noting every change, every sign of strain in the billionaire's once flawless presentation. One day, she saw a rare sight. The marble fountain in the front courtyard stood dry, its basin empty and cracked. The gardeners, once a team of 6, had been reduced to 2. Rumours trickled through old acquaintances in the neighbourhood, staff being let go, parties cancelled, the once flowing wine cellar locked. Victor was bleeding money and the world was beginning to notice. Still, Grace waited. She knew the danger of moving too soon. If Victor sensed her hand in any of this, he could sabotage the process or rally enough investors to save himself. This had to be clean, surgical. One evening, Henry called her directly. "It's happening," he said, without preamble. "The foreclosure has been finalized. The auction date is set for 3 weeks from now." Grace felt the words like an electric current. She thanked him, hung up, and stood in the middle of her apartment for a long moment, letting the reality sink in. 3 weeks, 21 days until she could walk into that marble foyer again, not as a maid, not as an intruder, but as the owner. Victor Lancaster had no idea the most dangerous enemy he faced was a woman he'd once dismissed without a second thought. The morning of the auction was crisp and clear, the kind of winter day where the sun felt cold and the air bit at your skin. Grace stood before the mirror in her apartment, fastening the last button on a navy coat. It was simple but elegant, the sort of thing that spoke of quiet means rather than ostentatious wealth. That was the image she needed today, someone respectable, unremarkable, forgettable, until the moment she signed her name on the winning bid. Evelyn had arranged everything. The trust was officially registered, the funds were in place, and Henry had confirmed the auction would be a small, exclusive affair in a panelled conference room at a downtown law firm. No media, no spectacle, just a handful of serious buyers and the bank's representatives. Grace arrived early, choosing a seat at the far end of the polished mahogany table. Around her, men in tailored suits murmured to one another, their cufflinks catching the light. A few glanced her way and then looked past her, dismissing her as a secretary or perhaps a minor assistant. She let them. At precisely 10 o'clock, the bank's auctioneer began reading the terms. The property, Lancaster Manor, was described in neutral, legal language, stripped of the grandeur Victor had always paraded before his guests. Square footage, acreage, fixtures, liens. To Grace, each sterile detail was a reminder that this house, which had once been her cage, was now just a number in a ledger. The bidding began. 2 men jumped in immediately, their offers climbing in steady increments. Grace waited, her hands folded, her expression placid. When the 3rd round came, Evelyn gave her a subtle nod. Grace raised her paddle for the first time. The men glanced at her, surprised, but neither seemed concerned. The bidding continued, back and forth, the numbers rising. Grace matched each one without hesitation. Her voice, when she spoke her offers aloud, was calm, even bored. One bidder dropped out. Then the other hesitated, his lips pressed into a thin line. Grace saw the exact moment his resolve cracked, his gaze flicking to his phone, calculating risk versus reward. When the auctioneer called her final bid and received no counter, the gavel came down with a crisp crack. "Sold," he said, "to the Whitmore Trust." No one in the room knew who stood behind that name. Not yet. Outside, Grace allowed herself a single deep breath. Evelyn's hand found her shoulder. "It's done," she said softly. "The deed will be in the trust's name by the end of the week." Grace nodded, but her thoughts were already ahead, on the moment she would walk through Lancaster Manor's doors again. Not with her head bowed, but with the authority of someone who owned every marble tile, every gilded frame. Victor Lancaster's fortress now belonged to the woman he had thrown out like she was nothing. The sky was low and grey the morning Grace returned to Lancaster Manor. A light mist clung to the air, softening the edges of the sprawling estate. She'd chosen her arrival deliberately, just after dawn, when the grounds would be quiet, and Victor, if he was still in residence, would be unprepared for visitors. The wrought iron gate swung open at her approach, the security guard on duty greeting her with polite indifference. He didn't know her face, not like the old staff had. That suited her perfectly. As the car eased up the long drive, Grace's eyes roamed over the familiar details, the bare winter hedges she used to trim, the cracked edge of the fountain still unrepaired, the high arched windows that had once felt like eyes watching her every move. She stepped out onto the gravel drive, the heels of her boots crunching softly. The front door opened before she could knock. It was Victor himself, dressed in a rumpled silk robe, his hair sticking up at odd angles. He squinted at her, confusion knitting his brow. "Who are you? What is this?" he demanded. Grace let the silence stretch a moment longer than necessary. Then she stepped forward, producing a crisp folder from her bag. "I'm here to take possession of the property," she said evenly. Victor's face reddened. "Possession? Of my house? You're out of your mind." She opened the folder to reveal the deed, the official stamps gleaming against the paper. "Not your house anymore, Mr. Lancaster. As of last week, Lancaster Manor is owned by the Whitmore Trust." His eyes scanned the page, his lips moving as he read. Then the realization hit. He straightened, his voice rising. "Whitmore Trust, that's—" "My trust," Grace finished for him, her tone unflinching. The color drained from his face, replaced by a flush of humiliation. "You—" "Yes," she said, cutting him off. "The maid you ordered out without a second thought. The woman you treated as if she were invisible. I now own this house, every inch of it." For a moment, the only sound was the faint hiss of the mist against the gravel. Then Victor laughed, a short, bitter bark. "What do you expect me to do, just leave?" Grace closed the folder. "I expect you to do exactly what you told me that night. Pack your things and get out." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The echo of his own words was enough to turn them into a weapon. Victor's glare could have cut glass, but he said nothing more. He turned and stalked up the stairs, his robe trailing behind him like a banner of defeat. Grace stepped into the marble foyer, the same space where he had humiliated her. Only now the air felt different, lighter, warmer, hers. 2 months later, Lancaster Manor no longer felt like the cold fortress it had once been. The air was warmer now, scented with fresh flowers from the garden she'd replanted herself. Laughter echoed down the halls, staff she had rehired, people she trusted, moving through the rooms without the stiff, fearful silence Victor had cultivated. The fountain in the courtyard bubbled again, its cracked basin restored. The gardens had returned to life, bright even in the late winter sun. Grace often walked the grounds in the early morning, a mug of coffee in hand, marveling at how quickly a place could change when its owner cared for it rather than used it as a stage for ego. Victor had not been seen since the day he left. Word through the grapevine was that he had moved into a small penthouse apartment downtown, selling off his art to pay legal fees. His empire had crumbled faster than even Grace had predicted. She felt no need to gloat. His downfall was his own doing. Inside the library, Grace kept a single reminder of the day everything changed. The wooden box her husband had left her. It sat on the mantel, its cedar scent faint but comforting. Sometimes she would open it, not for the documents it once held, but for the letter that had started it all. "One day, Grace, you'll need this." She had needed it, and more than that, she had needed the reminder of who she was, who she had always been. One quiet afternoon, Henry and Evelyn visited. They stood in the foyer, gazing up at the chandelier that had once glared down on Grace like a silent judge. "Looks different?" Henry remarked. "It feels different," Grace replied. "It's not about owning the house, it's about what it stands for now." Evelyn smiled. "And what's that?" "That arrogance doesn't last," Grace said simply. "And that strength, real strength, doesn't always look the way people expect." She thought back to the night she'd left with a suitcase in her hand and no clear plan. To the way Victor's voice had filled this very space, certain he was ending her story. He had only written the first page. Now the last page was hers. She turned to her friends, her voice soft but steady. If this story touched you, subscribe to the channel to discover more stories about how extraordinary people turn humiliation into triumph. The three of them walked toward the open doors, the winter sunlight spilling in, carrying the warmth of the house with them. Grace paused at the threshold, breathing in the air, and stepped outside, not leaving this time, but leading.